In 1984, in a quiet college town in Tennessee, an 18-year-old female student left her lunchtime shift and disappeared within just a few hours, with no one seeing anything unusual happen. Her car remained near her workplace intact, with no signs of a struggle, as if she had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. Just a few hours later, her body was discovered in a remote area, hastily covered with clothing, with evidence showing that a brutal attack had taken place right at the scene. Investigators quickly realized this was not a random crime, but every lead seemed to hit a dead end. A pair of men's jeans left near the body became the strangest piece of evidence, containing the answers, but which no one could decode at the time. Many suspects were brought into focus only to be ruled out. Conflicting statements and evidence that wasn't strong enough caused the investigation to gradually stall. As months and years passed, the case faded into silence, as if the perpetrator had escaped all suspicion and disappeared forever. But more than a decade later, when technology had advanced enough to speak for those old pieces of evidence, a seemingly insignificant detail began to reveal the entire truth in a way no one had anticipated. Before diving into this shocking development, please let us know where you are watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next cases. Every detail you are about to hear has been verified through court records, police investigation reports, autopsy results, and prosecutorial documents made public in court. In 1984, in the familiar calm of the city of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where the roads stretching around the Middle Tennessee State University campus were always full of students moving between classes, and the surrounding residential areas maintained a slow pace of life, almost isolated from the major upheavals of the outside world. It was an environment where most people believed that bad things could hardly happen. In that setting, Laura Salmon, 18 years old, was one of thousands of young students building their future. She attended the local university and worked part-time at the Kroger supermarket on Memorial Boulevard, a familiar job that helped her earn extra income and maintain a stable rhythm in her early college years. The day began like any other day. Laura arrived for her morning shift at Kroger, completed her duties, and was confirmed by the shift manager to leave the store around 1 p.m. This was the last time her presence was definitively recorded and authenticated by witnesses. After leaving work, Laura had a clear plan for the rest of the day. She intended to stop by the university campus to check her grades after the end of the semester, then go to her grandmother's house to swim, a familiar activity in the hot early summer days of Tennessee. Everything was arranged according to a simple and predictable schedule. However, as the afternoon passed, Laura's absence began to become noticeable. She did not appear at school as planned, nor did she go to her grandmother's house, and no one among those who knew her could confirm having seen her after leaving Kroger. Time continued to pass from early afternoon to late afternoon, then into the evening. The information gap grew longer and became increasingly difficult to explain, especially considering that Laura was a responsible person who always followed her preset plans. Her family began to clearly feel that this was no longer simply a normal delay. They proactively contacted friends, checked familiar locations, and tried to trace possible scenarios, but all efforts yielded no specific answers. As it began to get completely dark, the worry turned into a decision to seek intervention from the authorities. And that evening, a member of Laura's family directly contacted the Murfreesboro Police Department to report that she had gone missing. Right after the family reported Laura Salmon's disappearance that evening, the Murfreesboro Police Department took over the case and quickly classified it as a missing person case with suspicious signs, not the usual voluntary departure. Because the initial factors showed that the victim had a clear schedule and no reason to disappear suddenly, the assigned investigators began by collecting statements from family, colleagues, and people who had direct contact with Laura that day, from there determining the last time she was seen as at the Kroger supermarket on Memorial Boulevard around 1 p.m. This information was confirmed by the shift manager and many employees working at the same time, creating a highly reliable milestone in reconstructing the events. Based on this data, the police proceeded to build a detailed timeline extending from 1002 p.m. to around 6007 BOC. That day, this was considered the key time frame when Laura disappeared from all contact, and there were no direct witnesses confirming having seen her after leaving work. Next, the investigators checked the locations Laura planned to go, including the Middle Tennessee State University campus and her grandmother's house. Both places confirmed that Laura did not appear that day, which ruled out the possibility that she had simply changed plans without notifying her family. Along with verifying locations, The investigative force conducted a ground survey on the usual route connecting Kroger and the university, including main roads, side turns, and areas where a vehicle might be forced to stop. However, no signs of a traffic accident, vehicle breakdown, or any incident that could explain Laura being delayed or missing on the road were found. Stopping points such as gas stations, convenience stores, and parking lots in the area were also checked, but no witnesses confirmed having seen Laura after 1,000 miles. At the same time, the police checked data related to Laura's personal activities, including bank accounts, card transactions, and call logs. The results showed no financial activity or communication recorded after she left Kroger, which helped reinforce the conclusion that the incident had occurred in a very short time after she finished her shift. The investigators also noted that Laura did not carry luggage or items for a long trip, and all her plans for the day were short-term, which made the hypothesis that she had left on her own less likely. When compiling the initial data, a model of events began to form in which Laura left Kroger with a clear plan, but had not yet reached any location when she disappeared from the observation of all those who knew her, leaving no direct trace on the expected route. This led the investigators to conclude that Laura might have been approached or stopped in a very short time right after leaving work, at a position where no witnesses could observe, consistent with the context of a familiar area where the victim might not immediately recognize the danger. When the investigators determined that the time frame of Laura's disappearance was limited to just a few short hours after leaving Kroger in the early afternoon of that day, the focus immediately shifted to ground searches with speed and expanded scope, because in such cases every remaining trace in the area near the initial scene could play a key role. The Murfreesboro police force quickly coordinated with local volunteers to conduct a sweep of the area around the Kroger supermarket on Memorial Boulevard, including the parking lot, nearby roads, and routes leading to the outskirts, where a vehicle could leave the area in just a few minutes without attracting attention. The search teams were divided into small areas, moving in lines to observe the ground, curbs, and areas that could obstruct visibility, with the goal of detecting any signs related to Laura Salmon's sudden disappearance. During this process, one of the first important discoveries appeared when Laura's car was found still in the area near where she worked, which immediately drew the attention of the investigators because it provided a fixed point to reconstruct what might have happened after 1 p.m. The car had no signs of forced entry, no broken glass or obvious mechanical damage, and the parking position showed no signs of being moved after being placed there, which indicated that Laura had parked the car herself or left it under conditions without direct coercion shown through clear violence. When examining the inside of the car, the investigators noticed that the interior was still neat, with no signs of disturbance, no items overturned or traces of a struggle. Personal belongings such as wallet, documents, and everyday items were still intact, ruling out the possibility of an ordinary robbery. However, during a more thorough search, a small but notable detail was discovered, which was the presence of some hair strands that did not match Laura's characteristics. These hair strands were carefully collected and packaged as evidence, although at the time in 1984, analysis technology was not advanced enough to identify identity from hair samples accurately. This discovery, although it could not be exploited immediately, was still considered a sign that there was a possibility that another person had been present in the car or had contact with Laura in the short time before she disappeared. Along with treating the car as a secondary scene, the investigators conducted a full survey of the Kroger parking lot where Laura was believed to have left her work position. They searched for traces such as unusual tire marks, footprints on the ground, or any objects that might have been left behind during the incident. But no clear signs were found indicating that an open attack had occurred in this area. Potential witnesses, including customers and employees present at Kroger from 12:30 to 1:30, were also interviewed. However, no one reported seeing a fight, coercion, or any unusual situation involving Laura in the parking lot. This created a paradox in the initial investigation, because if Laura had been attacked right in this area, the incident would have happened quickly and discreetly enough not to attract the attention of those around. From an analytical perspective, the fact that the car remained in place and there were no signs of struggle inside suggested that Laura might have left the car in a very short time, possibly voluntarily in the first few seconds, before the situation turned dangerous. This hypothesis fit cases where the victim was approached by an acquaintance or someone with a convincing enough approach to make them not react immediately. Meanwhile, the search scope continued to be expanded to the routes leading away from the Kroger area, including less traveled roads and open lands. where a vehicle could quickly leave the central area without being noticed. The search teams moved along these routes, checking road edges, vacant lots, and areas that could be used to stop a vehicle temporarily. But in this phase, no discoveries were made that directly linked to Laura or provided clear clues about the direction of movement after she left the parking lot. The lack of witnesses and clear traces at the initial scene forced the investigators to rely more on logical inference from what remained, in which Laura's car became the center of all analysis. Because it represented the last point where everything was still in a normal state before the chain of events leading to the disappearance began. In the late afternoon of that day, in a remote area on the outskirts of the city of Murfreesboro, where the terrain gradually transitioned from residential areas to open lands and old quarry areas often called Lover's Lane by local residents, a place with little traffic during the day but not far enough from side roads to be accessible by vehicle. A local resident, while moving through this area, noticed some pieces of clothing scattered on the ground, a detail that initially might not have been too unusual in a desolate area. But the way they were placed and the presence of multiple layers of fabric piled on top made the person stop to observe more carefully. When approaching, the person realized that those pieces of clothing were not simply left behind, but seemed to be covering an object underneath. And when bending down to check, he discovered the shape of a human body, specifically a female body covered by those same layers of clothing. Realizing the seriousness of this discovery, the resident immediately left the position and called the authorities, providing the exact location of the discovery area. The Murfreesboro police force was dispatched to the scene shortly afterward, and when approaching the area, they quickly secured the scene to conduct a preliminary examination while ensuring no disturbance to any remaining traces. When the investigators began examining the body, they quickly recognized the similarity to the description of the missing person reported just a few hours earlier, and after conducting the initial confirmation steps, the victim's identity was determined to be Laura Salmon, who had just been reported missing by her family that evening. The discovery of the body, on the same day as the missing person report, completely changed the nature of the case, from an unclear missing person case to a homicide scene that needed to be handled with high priority. The location where the body was found was far from the Kroger area, and not on the direct route connecting Laura's workplace with the university or her grandmother's house, which immediately raised questions about how and when she was brought to this area, because it was not a natural destination in her schedule. The terrain around the scene included open land, patches of weeds, and dirt roads leading deeper into the quarry area, allowing a vehicle to access without being easily detected from the main roads. The investigators observed that the body was not completely exposed, but was covered with clothing, a detail indicating intervention after the victim was in the final position. This behavior could carry various meanings, from attempting to conceal, slow down the discovery process, to psychological factors of the perpetrator. The arrangement of the layers of clothing was not in a natural order, but seemed to have been placed hastily over the body, indicating that this action took place in a short time. There were no signs that the victim had moved to this area on her own, and the distance from Kroger to the scene could not be explained by walking within the determined time frame, further reinforced the conclusion that Laura had been brought here by vehicle after leaving work. The investigators also noted that this Lover's Lane area was not completely unfamiliar to local residents, but it was isolated enough for a serious incident to occur without being detected immediately, especially during the day when traffic was low. The fact that the body was discovered just a few hours after Laura disappeared showed that the time from when she left Kroger to when she was brought to the scene and left there was very short, which fit the initial hypotheses about an incident that happened quickly and under control. Right after the scene was secured and the victim's identity as Laura Salmon was confirmed, the investigators began a detailed examination of the surrounding area with the goal of reconstructing the events that had occurred in the short time before the body was discovered. And the very characteristics of the Lover's Lane area's terrain quickly showed why this place could become the endpoint of the chain of events. This area was separated from the main roads, surrounded by open land, grass, and small dirt paths leading deeper inside, limiting visibility and reducing the chance of being detected from a distance, especially during the day when traffic was low. During the observation of the ground surface and surrounding traces, the investigators recorded clear signs that Laura's body had not been lying in its initial position when the incident occurred, but had been moved. Specifically, there were drag marks on the ground leading to the final position where the body was found. These marks were not completely continuous, but clear enough to show that the body had been dragged over a short distance before being placed down. This suggested that the criminal act might have begun at a nearby point, after which the perpetrator had dragged the victim to the current position, possibly to conceal it better or to avoid leaving clear traces at the initial attack point. When continuing to examine the body and the layers of clothing covering it, the investigators noticed that the clothing was not worn on the victim's body in the usual way, but was placed on top of the body, some parts covering the upper body but not completely covering it. Exposing other areas, this arrangement had no signs of care but was hasty, as if the action had been carried out quickly before leaving the scene. The use of the clothing itself to cover also showed that the perpetrator did not bring specialized items to conceal, but used what was available on site. During a more thorough sweep of the surrounding area, an important piece of evidence was discovered, which was a pair of men's jeans lying near the body. These jeans did not match the victim's clothing and were immediately marked as an object that could be directly related to the perpetrator. The investigators proceeded to record the exact position of the jeans, photograph it, measure the distance between it and the body, as well as the surrounding traces to determine whether it had been left during a struggle or removed and discarded after the criminal act ended. Upon preliminary examination, the jeans showed no signs of being torn by strong pulling force, which led the investigators to consider the possibility that it had been taken off rather than yanked during a struggle. At the same time, the ground traces around the scene were analyzed to determine the number of people present at the time of the incident, and the initial results did not show signs of multiple overlapping footprints or complex movement directions. Instead, the traces were relatively simple, consistent with a scenario involving only one perpetrator and one victim. There was no clear evidence of the presence of multiple subjects at the same time, and there were also no signs that the victim had attempted to flee over a long distance, which could indicate that the incident occurred quickly and within a limited area. Another factor that the investigators paid special attention to was the condition of the victim's belongings, because in many cases the loss of property could provide clues about motive. However, at this scene, there were no signs that property had been taken as a primary target. Personal items were not rummaged through or scattered around, and there were no signs of searching for property in the area. This made the robbery hypothesis less consistent with what was observed at the scene. The investigators continued to expand the examination scope to the surrounding area, checking bushes, dirt paths, and positions that could be used to access or leave the scene, while marking each point with traces for later reconstruction. Every detail, from the direction of the drag marks, the position of the men's jeans, to the way the layers of clothing were placed on the body, was carefully recorded, because in a scene with few witnesses like this, the smallest physical traces could become decisive factors in understanding the sequence of actions that had taken place in that short but decisive time frame. After the scene examination was completed and all evidence was collected, Laura Salmon's body was transferred to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy, an important step to accurately determine the cause of death and clarify the mechanism of the crime based on biological evidence. The autopsy process was performed by the forensic pathologist with the support of the investigators, beginning with an overall examination of the body to record all injury traces, from there, reconstructing the chain of behavior that had occurred before the victim died. The initial results showed that Laura died from severe head trauma, caused by repeated strong impacts to the head area, a type of injury that could not occur from an ordinary accident, but required intentional and continuous attack behavior. When analyzing the wounds in detail, the forensic pathologist determined that there were multiple impact points on the skull, with characteristics consistent with the use of a hard, non-sharp object. And when compared with the scene, the stones available in the area were identified as the most suitable weapon, which showed that the perpetrator did not bring a weapon beforehand but had used objects available at the scene. This characteristic often appeared in impulsive attacks or when the perpetrator had not prepared tools in advance, but still had the ability to control the situation. However, the number and severity of the wounds also showed another factor, which was the repetition of the attack behavior beyond what was necessary to cause death. Many wounds were recorded in a state where the victim no longer had the ability to resist, which reflected a level of violence higher than the minimum necessary, showing that the perpetrator continued to inflict injuries even when the victim had been completely subdued. The signs on the body also did not show the presence of another type of weapon. with no cuts or signs of sharp objects, reinforcing the conclusion that the entire criminal act was carried out using objects at the scene. In addition, the forensic pathologist determined the time of death based on many biological factors, including body temperature, rigor mortis, and initial decomposition signs. The results showed that Laura died on the same day, within just a few hours after she left Kroger in the early afternoon, which was consistent with the time frame that the investigators had previously determined when building the disappearance timeline. The fact that the time of death fell on the same day helped significantly narrow the scope of the investigation, because it ruled out the possibility that the victim had been held for a long time before being brought to the scene. During the autopsy, the experts also checked for defensive signs, such as scratches on the hands or arms, to determine whether the victim had a chance to resist or not. However, these traces were not clear, which could indicate that the attack happened quickly, or the victim did not have enough time to react effectively. Biological samples collected from the victim's body and clothing were also preserved for later analysis, although at the time in 1984, the ability to extract information from these samples was still limited. Synthesizing the forensic results, a clearer picture began to form, in which Laura had been attacked with strong force multiple times to the head area, using objects available at the scene. This behavior occurred in a relatively short time, but enough to cause fatal injuries, and was carried out by a subject who did not use a carried weapon, but utilized the surrounding environment. The level of violence shown through the number of wounds indicated that the behavior did not stop as soon as the goal was achieved, but continued longer, a factor often considered by investigators when assessing the perpetrator's psychological state and motive. In 1984, in the familiar calm of the city of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, the conclusions from the forensic autopsy had clarified the cause of death and significantly narrowed the time frame of the crime, creating a foundation for the investigative force to move to the phase of reviewing people, where every relationship around Laura Salmon was systematically and thoroughly examined. The first focus was on the people who had direct contact with Laura on that day, especially at the Kroger supermarket on Memorial Boulevard, where she was last seen around 1 p.m. The colleagues working the same shift were interviewed individually to avoid influencing each other in their statements. Each person was asked to describe Laura's state before she left, from her attitude and behavior to any conversations that took place during the shift. However, all agreed that she left work in a normal state with no signs of stress or anxiety. From Kroger, the interview scope was expanded to friends and acquaintances at Middle Tennessee State University, where Laura had planned to stop by that afternoon. The students who knew her were asked about the recent days, whether anyone had noticed any change in her behavior or heard her mention any personal issues, but the results obtained were still consistent with the initial conclusion that Laura had no major conflicts, was not threatened, and showed no signs of being followed or harassed. Her family also provided similar information, stating that Laura's life was stable, with no significant disputes in her personal relationships, which made it impossible for the investigators to identify a clear motive originating from those close to her. In that context, the investigation direction was forced to expand into two parallel possibilities. The first possibility being that the perpetrator belonged to the group of acquaintances, possibly someone who had previously had contact with Laura and took advantage of the familiarity to approach her without causing an immediate defensive reaction. This hypothesis was reinforced by the lack of signs of a struggle in the car and no witnesses recording coercive behavior in the parking lot. The second possibility was that the perpetrator was a complete stranger, someone who had approached Laura in a very short time and controlled the situation quickly enough not to attract the attention of those around, consistent with the reality that the Kroger area at that time had no surveillance cameras and no one reported seeing anything unusual. To check these two directions, the investigators began building a detailed list of people who had contacted Laura in the period before she disappeared. This list included classmates, colleagues, social acquaintances, and any individuals who had direct or indirect contact with her. Each person had a separate profile, recording personal information, schedule on that day, and related relationships. The alibi verification process was carried out in parallel, in which the investigators cross-checked each person's statements with independent information sources, aiming to detect inconsistencies that could lead to suspicion. Individuals with a history of violent behavior or who had previously had conflicts with Laura were prioritized for more thorough examination, although this number was very limited. Besides focusing on personal relationships, the police also reviewed crime reports in the Murfreesboro area and surrounding regions to determine if any similar incidents had occurred before. thereby assessing the possibility that this was the behavior of a subject unknown to the victim. However, no clear crime pattern was identified in this phase. The lack of direct witnesses, lack of physical evidence that could identify identity, and no clear signs of motive made the investigation process heavily dependent on the elimination method. Gradually narrowing the scope by ruling out unsuitable possibilities, the investigators continuously cross-referenced statements between individuals, looking for even the smallest contradictions, because in cases without witnesses, seemingly insignificant details sometimes became the key to opening new directions. At the same time, the evidence collected from the scene and the car, including the strange hair strands and the men's jeans, was added to the comparison list. Although at the time in 1984, scientific analysis capabilities did not allow for accurate identification from these samples, they still served as physical markers to compare with potential suspects in the future. From the list of individuals compiled in the initial investigation phase, the investigators began cross-referencing each person with the evidence collected at the scene and from Laura Salmon's car, in which the pair of men's jeans found near the body quickly became one of the most important pieces of evidence. Because it was an object clearly not belonging to the victim and had the potential to directly link to the perpetrator, the jeans were sent to the laboratory for detailed analysis, including measuring the waist circumference, leg length, and wear characteristics to determine the build of the wearer. The results showed that the jeans were of a relatively large size, suitable for a tall and large man, which helped the investigators narrow the scope when comparing with individuals on the suspect list. In addition, the experts also examined the fabric surface for biological traces, including blood and any remaining bodily fluids, and during this process, they discovered biological samples on the jeans. However, at the time in 1984, DNA analysis technology had not developed enough to identify specific identity from these samples. The methods at that time mainly relied on blood type or serological characteristics, which could only narrow the pool of suspects but not accurately identify an individual. Therefore, although the evidence provided an important signal, it still could not be used as direct evidence to charge. Along with analyzing the evidence, the investigators continued to review the suspect list based on criteria such as the ability to access the victim, physical characteristics, and behavioral history. And during this process, one name began to attract more attention than the others. That was John Taylor, an individual who had indirect contact with Laura through social activities and shared living environment in the local area. Taylor was known for having a history of violent behavior in personal relationships, especially toward women, which made him a subject that needed more thorough checking. The investigators proceeded to collect information about Taylor's schedule on that day, while searching for any evidence that could place him in the area where the crime occurred during the relevant time frame. The comparison of Taylor's physical characteristics with the information inferred from the men's jeans was also carried out to determine whether he matched the initial profile of the person who might have worn those jeans. In addition, the hair samples and other biological traces collected in Laura's car were also included in the comparison process, although analysis capabilities were still limited. During the interrogation, Taylor denied any involvement in the incident, and the investigators had to rely on cross-checking his statements with witnesses and indirect evidence. Some initial factors seemed to fit the suspect hypothesis, but when going deeper into the analysis, the physical evidence was not strong enough to form a tight chain of links. The men's jeans, although sized to fit someone with a similar build, had no specific signs that could directly link it to Taylor, and the biological samples on it also could not be used to identify identity accurately in the context of the technology at that time. In addition, no witnesses confirmed having seen Taylor with Laura that day, and there was no evidence placing him at the scene at the time of the crime. The investigators were forced to reevaluate all the data, weighing reasonable suspicion against the evidentiary standards necessary to proceed with prosecution, and in this case, what they had only stopped at the level of suspicion and had not reached the threshold to charge. The following weeks and months after the initial suspects were reviewed did not bring any clear breakthrough and pushed the investigation into Laura Salmon's death into a difficult phase, where every direction seemed to lead to the limits of the evidence and technology at that time. The investigators continued to expand the suspect list, conducted more interviews, cross-checked statements, and reviewed the collected data again, but no individual could be placed at the scene with a sufficient level of certainty to proceed with prosecution. The men's jeans, The biological samples obtained from the scene and the strange hair strands in the car remained the most important pieces of evidence, but all were frozen in legal value due to the limitations of forensic science in 1984. When DNA technology had not been widely applied in criminal investigations and the existing analysis methods only allowed for determining general characteristics such as blood type or hair structure, which were not enough to identify a specific individual, forensic experts could conclude that these samples did not belong to the victim, but could not go further to indicate who they belonged to, making those seemingly key pieces of evidence unable to be transformed into tools for charging. Meanwhile, efforts to find additional witnesses also yielded no results. No one came forward to provide new information about what had happened in the time frame from 1 p.m. to the late afternoon of that day, and no reports of suspicious behavior in the area at that time were confirmed. Over time, new sources of information gradually dried up, and the investigators were forced to go back and check the entire file from the beginning, re-examining every small detail to look for any point that might have been overlooked. But the results remained unchanged. The absence of a clear suspect combined with the inability to fully exploit the evidence caused the case to fall into a state of stagnation, a situation that many criminal investigations in the same period also had to face. By the end of 1984, after many months without significant progress, the case file was officially classified as a cold case, meaning the active investigation was temporarily suspended and would only be reopened when new information or technology could change the situation. This decision did not mean the case was abandoned, but was a shift to a systematic archiving state where all evidence, documents, and investigation notes were carefully preserved for future analysis. The important pieces of evidence, including the men's jeans, the biological samples collected from the scene, and the strange hair strands in the car, were packaged according to standard procedures and stored under controlled conditions to prevent decomposition or contamination. Because the investigators were clearly aware that their true value could only be exploited when forensic science reached a higher level of development, the case file, including interview records, scene reports, autopsy results, and initial analyses, was rearranged in detail so that any future investigative team could access and understand the entire picture without having to start over from the beginning. The period of many years after Laura Salmon's case file was transferred to cold case status did not bring any significant progress until the late 1990s, when the forensic science context began to change markedly with the development and increasingly reliable application of DNA analysis technology in criminal investigations. In light of these advances, the Murfreesboro Police Department conducted a comprehensive review of unsolved cases, especially those files with biological evidence stored from before but never analyzed by modern methods, and Laura's case was quickly placed on the priority list due to its serious nature along with the existence of many potential pieces of evidence. The file was then transferred to a new investigator, Dan Goodwin, who had a special connection to the case as he had once been a friend of Laura at Middle Tennessee State University. This factor not only gave him a deeper understanding of the social environment in which Laura had lived and studied, but also created a strong personal motivation in pursuing the case. Upon taking over the file, Goodwin began by reviewing all the original documents from 1984, including scene reports, forensic autopsy results, interview records, and initial analyses, with the goal of identifying any loose ends or details that could be re-exploited from a modern scientific perspective. During this process, he noticed that many important pieces of evidence, especially the men's jeans, the biological samples obtained from the scene, and the strange hair strands in Laura's car, had never been analyzed using DNA technology due to the limitations of the previous period, and these very pieces of evidence could contain decisive information if reprocessed with new methods. From that observation, the investigation direction was adjusted markedly. Instead of continuing to focus on searching for new witnesses, which had yielded no results for many years, the focus was shifted to re-exploiting the physical evidence that had been preserved in storage. Goodwin worked with forensic experts to determine which samples were still eligible for DNA analysis, while rechecking the previous preservation process to ensure that the samples had not been contaminated or degraded to the point of being unusable. The selected pieces of evidence included the men's jeans found at the scene, where there were biological traces that had not been fully exploited, along with samples collected from the victim's body and clothing, all of which were repackaged and sent to the laboratory with a request for analysis using modern DNA techniques. This process was not simply applying new technology to old samples, but also required close coordination between the investigator and forensic experts to ensure that every result obtained could be accurately linked to the data in the original file. At the same time, Goodwin also reviewed the old suspect list again, cross-referencing with the possibility of collecting DNA samples from these individuals in the new legal context, in preparation for comparison when the analysis results were completed. The reanalysis process of the evidence stored since 1984 quickly brought results that could not have been achieved before, especially with the pair of men's genes found near Laura Salmon's body. When forensic experts applied modern DNA technology to extract and analyze the remaining biological samples on the fabric surface, after more than a decade of preservation, these genes still contained enough traces for testing, and the analysis results showed the presence of a clear male DNA profile, completely separate from the victim's DNA, confirming that the wearer of the genes was not Laura, but another unidentified individual. This discovery immediately reinforced the initial hypothesis that the men's genes belonged to the perpetrator, because it was found at the scene in direct connection with the body, and there was no reasonable explanation for an unrelated person to leave their clothing at that location. Having a complete DNA profile from the evidence had significantly changed the nature of the investigation, because for the first time, the investigators had in hand a biological marker capable of identifying a specific identity, rather than just stopping at general characteristics as before. Along with DNA extraction, the experts also reanalyzed the bloodstains on the genes using blood spatter analysis, a technique that had developed significantly compared to the initial time, allowing determination of how the bloodstains were formed based on their shape, size, and position on the fabric surface. The analysis results showed that the bloodstains were concentrated mainly in the thigh area of the genes, with characteristics of blood droplets spattered from medium to strong impact force, consistent with a situation where a person was near the source of blood when the violent act occurred. The position of the bloodstains, combined with the direction of spatter and distribution density, allowed the experts to conclude that the wearer of the genes was likely in a kneeling or low-bending position when the wounds were inflicted, a detail of important significance in reconstructing the behavior at the scene. This fit with the previously recorded drag marks and body position, and also showed that the perpetrator was not only present at the scene after the incident, but directly participated in the act of attacking the victim. The combination of the DNA profile and blood spatter analysis created a clearer picture of the role of the wearer of the men's genes, ruling out the possibility that this was just evidence left behind randomly or related to a third party not directly involved in the crime. The investigators could now determine that the genes were part of the criminal act, and the wearer was the one who had carried out the violent behavior leading to Laura's death. In addition, determining the perpetrator's posture during the crime also provided additional information about the method of attack, showing that the behavior did not occur from a distance, but at a very close range with a level of control sufficient to maintain the position throughout the process of inflicting injuries. These facts not only helped reinforce the initial forensic conclusions, but also added depth to the reconstruction of the scene, turning previous speculations into conclusions based on specific scientific grounds. The appearance of the male DNA profile from the men's genes along with the blood spatter conclusions had created a new standard to reevaluate the entire suspect list, forcing the investigators to go back to each name that had been considered in 1984 and cross-reference them with the newly established scientific facts, rather than relying only on statements and inferences as before. During this review process, the file of David Kyle Gilley began to attract attention again, because he had once been on the initial suspect list due to a previous romantic relationship with Laura Salmon, but had been ruled out quite early based on an alibi statement provided by relatives, a factor at that time accepted without a full independent verification process. When investigator Dan Goodwin reviewed the section of the file related to Gilley, he noticed that the alibi confirmation in the initial investigation had only stopped at recording the statement without cross-checking steps with objective data sources, which created a significant gap in the reliability of the previous exclusion conclusion. Along with reviewing the file, Goodwin also proceeded to locate again the witnesses who had been recorded but not fully exploited, and among them, an important witness was re-identified. This person had previously reported that on the day the body was discovered, they had seen a man driving Laura's car near the Lover's Lane area where the body was found. However, this information in the initial investigation had not led to a specific identification. When approached again many years later, this witness was asked to review the related photos and files, and this time they confirmed that the person they had seen was David Kyle Gilly. This detail immediately created a direct link between Gilly and the victim's car and the time frame related to the case. The fact that an individual was seen driving the victim's vehicle near the scene was a factor of high evidentiary value, especially when combined with the new forensic facts. It not only placed Gilly in the chain of events, but also opened up the possibility that he had directly participated in moving the victim or handling the scene. The investigators continued to cross-reference Gilly's physical characteristics with the analysis results of the men's genes, including height, build, and body size, and noticed a significant match with the parameters previously determined, which further reinforced the hypothesis that the genes could belong to him. In addition, information about Gilly's past behavior was also reviewed again, including reports of controlling personality and tendencies toward violence in personal relationships, factors that previously had not been fully evaluated in the context of lacking supporting physical evidence. The combination of the newly confirmed witness statement, the uncertainty of the initial alibi, and the match with the physical evidence had created a much stronger suspect profile than before, forcing the investigators to replace Gilly at the center of the investigation. Goodwin and his team proceeded to recheck Gilly's entire schedule on that day, while searching for independent sources of information that could confirm or refute the previous statement, to determine whether the alibi he provided truly held up when cross-referenced with objective facts or not. The fact that David Kyle Gilly's suspect profile was brought back to the center of the investigation, combined with the unidentified male DNA profile from the men's genes, had created a decisive step in the investigators' strategy. When they began carrying out the necessary legal procedures to collect a direct DNA sample from Gilly in order to compare it with the evidence sample obtained at the scene in 1984, this process could not be carried out arbitrarily, but had to be based on a court order built on the reinforced suspicious factors, including the witness statement confirming Gilly had driven Laura Salmon's car near the area where the body was discovered, the uncertainty of the initial alibi, and the physical characteristic match with the men's genes. After approval, Gilly's DNA sample was collected through the buccal swab method, ensuring accuracy and non-invasiveness, then sent to the laboratory for comparative analysis with the DNA profile already extracted from the evidence. This process was carried out with high accuracy, using genetic sequence analysis techniques that allow determination of the degree of match between the two samples at various genetic locations to rule out the possibility of random coincidence. When the results were returned, they showed a complete match between Gilly's DNA and the male DNA sample obtained from the men's genes at the scene, a conclusion of decisive significance because it provided direct biological evidence linking him to the crime scene, far beyond the level of speculation or suspicion before. This match not only confirmed that Gilly had worn the men's genes found near the body, but also placed him in a position directly related to the criminal act, especially when combined with the blood spatter analysis that had indicated the wearer of the jeans was in a kneeling position when the attack occurred. With the DNA evidence in hand, the investigators had sufficient legal basis to make an arrest, and in 2000, about 16 years after the crime occurred, David Kyle Gilly was officially arrested, marking the first time a suspect was clearly identified in a case that had been stalled for many years. The arrest took place in the context of the evidence having been reinforced to a level that could be presented in court, and immediately afterward, Gilly was put through the interrogation process to clarify his role in the events of that day. During the interrogation sessions, the investigators focused on cross-referencing Gilly's statements with the physical evidence, especially the DNA profile, because this was a factor he could hardly deny or reasonably explain. When asked about the presence of his DNA on the men's genes at the scene, Gilly could not provide a convincing explanation. No scenario was offered that could explain how his evidence appeared in direct connection with the victim's body. The inconsistencies in his statements, combined with the inability to deny the scientific evidence, further weakened his position in the investigation process. The investigators also continued to recheck other details in the file, including witness statements and data from 1984, to ensure that every factor fit with the new conclusions established from the DNA. The trial of David Kyle Gilly was opened in the state of Tennessee in 2006, more than 2 decades since the day Laura Salmon was murdered, and the entire legal proceedings quickly focused on the core question: whether the modern scientific evidence was strong enough to clearly determine the criminal responsibility of the defendant or not. The prosecution built its argument on a tightly linked system of evidence, in which the focus was the DNA sample obtained from the men's genes at the scene, determined to be a complete match with Gilly's DNA through multi-point genetic analyses, a method that allowed comparison of multiple markers with very high accuracy. The summoned forensic experts presented in detail before the jury how the samples had been preserved since 1984, emphasizing that they had been stored under strict controlled conditions to avoid contamination and quality degradation, and explained that modern DNA analysis procedures had the ability to recover and accurately determine genetic information even after many years. They also clarified that the probability of a random match between two unrelated individuals was extremely low, thereby affirming that the DNA sample on the men's genes could not belong to anyone other than Gilly. Along with the DNA evidence, the prosecutors presented the results of the blood spatter analysis, showing that the bloodstains on the genes were concentrated in the thigh area, with characteristics of droplets spattered from strong impact force, which was explained as a sign that the wearer of the genes was in a kneeling or low-bending position when the attack occurred, a detail that helped reconstruct the posture and direct role of the perpetrator at the scene. The jury also heard the testimony of the witness who had seen a man driving Laura's car near the area where the body was discovered, and this person had identified Gilly during the reinvestigation. This factor created a clear link between the defendant and the victim's vehicle and the time frame related to the case. To further reinforce the argument about motive, the prosecution presented statements related to Gilly's past violent behavior toward Laura, including descriptions of controlling personality and harmful behaviors and the relationship between the two, thereby building a psychological context that could lead to criminal behavior. The defense responded by focusing on creating reasonable doubt. They emphasized that at the scene, there still existed other biological traces not belonging to Gilly, arguing that the presence of DNA from multiple sources could indicate the possibility of someone else being involved, or at least weaken the uniqueness of the evidence. They also questioned the possibility of cross-contamination during the evidence preservation process over many years, trying to convince that the long storage could affect the reliability of the analysis results. In response to these arguments, the forensic experts continued to explain that the sample preservation and handling procedures had been carried out according to strict standards, and that the existence of other DNA samples did not change the value of the main DNA sample found on the men's genes, because this was evidence with a direct connection to the criminal act and its position of the scene could not be explained by an innocent scenario. The prosecutors continuously brought the focus back to the question of the presence of the DNA, asking the jury to consider whether there existed any reasonable explanation for Gilly's DNA appearing on the evidence at the scene or not, especially when combined with other facts such as the witness statement and blood spatter analysis. The jury's verdict was delivered after the deliberation process and determined that David Kyle Gilly was guilty of murdering Laura Salmon, marking the legal endpoint for a case that had lasted more than 2 decades, in which elements once seen as disconnected were now connected into a chain of events with logic and consistency. The life sentence was pronounced in 2006, reflecting the severity of the criminal act, while also expressing the court's view that the scientific evidence, especially DNA, had eliminated all reasonable doubt about the identity of the perpetrator. In the final presentation, the prosecutor reaffirmed that Gilly's motive stemmed from control and jealousy after the relationship between him and Laura ended, a factor reinforced by statements about his past violent behavior, showing that this was not a random impulsive act, but the result of an escalation process in behavior. The facts established throughout the trial showed that the perpetrator had approached the victim in a short time after she left work, taken her to a remote area, and carried out the attack using objects available at the scene, specifically stones, causing severe head trauma leading to death. The level of attack, shown through the number of impacts and the force used, indicated that the perpetrator continued to inflict injuries even when the victim no longer had the ability to resist, a factor reflecting the brutal nature of the behavior. After committing the crime, Gilly had carried out actions to conceal the crime, including using clothing to cover the body, in effort to reduce the chance of immediate detection while leaving the scene without leaving clear signs of identity at that time. However, these concealment actions were only temporary, because the men's genes he left at the scene had become the most important piece of evidence, containing biological traces that could not be completely erased. In the context of 1984, the limitations of technology made these traces unable to be exploited, allowing the perpetrator to avoid being identified in the early stage. But when DNA technology developed, those very traces became the decisive evidence leading to the identification of the perpetrator. The final investigation showed that the perpetrator not being arrested for many years was not due to perfection in concealment, but due to the limitations of forensic science at the time of the crime, an objective factor that had slowed the process of identifying the culprit. When modern DNA analysis techniques were applied, the entire structure of the case was reconstructed based on biological evidence, allowing a direct link of Gilly to the scene and the criminal act without having to rely completely on statements. The case therefore became a typical example of how DNA technology could change the outcome of investigations that seemed to have reached a dead end, especially in cold cases where evidence had been stored for a long time. The final verdict not only closed a legal file but also confirmed that seemingly small elements, such as a pair of jeans left at the scene, could carry decisive value when analyzed under the light of modern science, while also showing that the time gap, even if spanning many years, is not an absolute barrier to tracking down and determining criminal responsibility in serious cases. If you want to continue following cases that seem to have fallen into oblivion but were ultimately clarified thanks to science and persistence, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you for following until the end. See you in the next video with another case that is still waiting to be decoded.